Welcome to the Mission Minded podcast, where we dive deep into Scripture and ask ourselves what it means to live out the Great Commission. Let's jump into today's episode.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Mission Minded podcast. We're so glad that you're tuning in with us today. Last episode we talked about creation in the sense of why God created rather than the what. And in this episode we want to dive a little deeper into the nitty-gritty of the creation story itself and talk about all of the different kinds of creation stories that are out there in order to give greater detail into why the creation story in the Bible is so specific and unique. So, Dr. Einstein, could you start out by kind of going through the days of creation and going into a little more detail as to why they're so important for us in reading Genesis?
Yeah, so that's a great overview of why we're doing this, and I think when we actually look at Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, and just breaking that pivotal verse down into more practical terms, more bite-sized terms, if you will, because there's really about 5 different cosmological / theological things going on there that we should explore. And we've already talked about the nature of time, and we've seen that. We're going to continue to talk about the nature of God, and it's very interesting that the word for God there in Genesis 1:1 is actually Elohim, not Yahweh. We need to understand why. The difference between Yahweh and Elohim, we'll get into that, especially when we get further into Genesis with 6. But right now we are in that place where in the beginning God created. So here's the cool thing: we know that God created, right? We're told in Scripture that the beginning of wisdom is the fear, the awe, the respect, the wonder of God. And so, to me, if we start with this concept of God creating, we're actually going to end up with what I would consider more of a rational understanding of reality, especially when we get into, my favorite, homochirality and organic chemistry and some really cool
I'm excited
things,
for that
right?
one.
That are coming way down the pipe. So this whole conversation about what's going on with Genesis 1, is it different than Genesis 2? And we end up with a lot of different attempts to try to harmonize Genesis 1:1 with maybe some current modern philosophy, modern science. And here's the difficulty that we're going to run into when we approach, as we talked about in the last podcast, when we talk about the difference between the why versus the how and the what. We talk about the difference between whether or not the narrative of Genesis is a form narrative, or is it more of a function narrative. I'm gonna say that the ancient cosmology would be more focused on the function cosmology. And by the way, it doesn't negate the form cosmology. I would view it kind of like as a 2-layer, that it's going to talk some level about form, but mostly about function, right? So we use the analogy of a computer. When is a computer really a computer? It's actually when a person sits down and uses it, that's when it functions as what it was intended to function as. And we could talk about its form of the plastic and the battery and the ones and zeros but until that gets used for what it was actually made for, it really doesn't have its ontology, its being for what it was created for. So that's why the whole conversation about the creation event is so important to us, right? It's foundational to our understanding of who we are, because if we're created for a specific form or function, it's going to matter if we're living that out, because we're trying to find the good life, the eudaimonia. So through history, when you actually look at the different attempts to bring in this creation narrative, the most historical actually is the 6 literal 24-hour day period. That's all the way up through probably mid Enlightenment. You actually have that view very dominant within the church, and it's not until more recent theology or more recent science, quote unquote, that we begin to question that level of historicity. But let's just be honest, not very many people that push around in the science world are comfortable with a literal 24 day narrative for Genesis, because hasn't science, quote unquote, proven that the universe is around 16 billion years old? And what do we do with that? And what I would say to this, going into this, because we're not, let's face it, we've been hashing this out in the church and in philosophy for decades. So it's not like, hey, we were going to come up with the actual answer.
Yeah.
But what I do want us to be sensitive to is the fact that science, by its very nature, is not some locked box that everything works and everything functions perfectly. Science is ongoing. I was just having the conversation today, actually, in one of my classes, that we have through history of just the concept of thermodynamics and chemistry. We have multiple different views on how heat and energy flow through matter and through time and space. And so if I say this is what thermodynamics looks like, and I'm using an 1870 textbook, it's going to be very different than what we talk about today. So I want to be careful that we don't take something that is very, very specifically written to a function and impose on that what we've already talked about, some modern cosmology that has a very skewed version of what our reality actually looks like. And the reason for that is because I think what happens with this whole conversation, we have some assumptions, and I'll just say this. I really want our audience to really understand that from a scientific perspective, the nature of time and space and energy is still, and gravity is still largely a mystery. We don't have some unified way of it all coming together. And we have a lot of assumptions that are presuppositional to a theory that we might talk about, and one of those really important theories or assumptions that I want our listeners to know is we have something that's called the time translation invariance. Now that's a mouthful, but the time translation invariance is oftentimes not talked about in the cosmogony and cosmology that we need to, and that is an assumption, very important. This invariance is an assumption that all laws, quantum, Einstein, whatever law you want, they're assumed to be the same, if you will, everywhere in the universe and at all times. Okay, now that is not a very good assumption, to be honest with you. And that's one that I think so oftentimes gets tripped up when we start talking about the creation week. Because if this time translation invariance is correct, then yeah, we could probably make from that assumption a model that looks like we have today. But here's why I challenge that assumption. If you just take, and this is, again, I'll kind of geek out a little bit, but I'll try to take this slow. If you take 100 years, okay, so let's say from 18 or let's say 1926 to 2026, you take that 100 years and you break that 100 years down into seconds, you end up with 3.16 times 10 to the about 9. Well, actually not. It is to the 9 seconds. Okay. If you take that same time frame of 16 billion years, which is kind of the current idea of how old the universe might be, that's 5.05 times 10 to the 17 seconds. Now that might, those big terms, so to the 9 and to the 17. If you take that tiny little snippet of 100 years and you transpose it onto 16 billion, it's 1/1000th, less than 1/1000th of that timeline. And here we are as quote unquote enlightened scientists extrapolating back with only 1/1000th, less than 1/1000th of an understanding of the ultimate totality of the universe and its history. And we have the arrogance to say, because we understand, or we think we understand, what's going on in that less than 1/1000th of the universe's history, therefore the 16 billion, this is what's gone on. I think there's a really important point to make, that we have no clue what happened in the past of the universe when we see the totality of what 16 billion years really is in time. So with that, when we look at these creation stories, to me, one of the biggest errors I personally get frustrated with, and I push back again whenever I can, when I teach or when I speak, is I don't believe the 6 days of Genesis are what we would call scientific today. I don't think that chemistry is chemistry or physics is physics. I think we might have had mathematics during those 6 days, but not chemistry. Because what does it look like before we have a world of photons or a world of electrons and protons and what does it look like before we have space, or what does it look like before we have space-time? What's happening in those 6 days is actually the Lord is bringing into existence what we know today as particles, matter, mass, energy, light. And so that those pieces of the universe are actually coming into existence, right? So what in the world's going on? This is so much bigger than our finite little humanity can put together, that to me, I would rather approach this in a very humble way and say, you know what? I actually think we need a lot of help to understand the way this was brought together. And that's what I believe Genesis 1 to be. It is an overview of a very basic, and I would argue towards the function side of what was happening during the original creation. Because here's what's happened in recent, in the last couple of hundred years. Again, we have the history of the church is going to be the 6 literal 24-hour days, but because of modern science, everyone goes, I don't really like that. You're one of those, fundamentalist, low thinking church people that thinks God spoke and therefore it is. And at some level, yeah, I'm actually am that person. But here's the thing. It's only recently that we started messing with that narrative. And so a couple of the big ones that are really important, and one that you'll see like with, if you go to like a study Bible, like a Schofield study Bible, this is one of the big ones where we had the gap theory, right? And the gap theory basically says that there was a gap between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, and there was all this Middle Earth type of stuff going on, and then everything got weird, and the angels were made, and they rebelled, and then verse 2, we start all over again. And that's in a lot of people's study Bibles. And so when people are reading through Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, they'll flip down to their study Bible, and there's Schofield, right? Good old C.I. Schofield saying, yep, there's a gap. And so that is an attempt to try to say, hey, science has quote unquote proven that the universe is old. The Bible says it's young. Therefore, how do we bring this? Oh, there must have been a gap. That's number one. Mm-hmm. The number two is what's really still around quite a bit, and that's going to be what we call the day age theory, and this was from like someone like Hugh Ross, and I think Hugh Ross has some really good science, and I don't throw everything out that Hugh Ross says. I question something. The biggest problem I have with this whole day age is, and here's one thing I would challenge our listeners. I actually personally, as a scientist, don't really wrestle with Genesis 1 or Genesis chapter 1 or Genesis chapter 2. I would encourage our listeners to go back and actually read Exodus 20:11. Okay, I have that actually, and I can pull it up in my Bible. But and Rachel, if you want to read,
Bible too.
Yeah, read when you get to it. I'll just to me, the real problem with this whole narrative is not Genesis 1 or Genesis 2, because I'll be honest with you, the word yom that we use for day, there was day 1. That word within the Hebrew context, it has flexibility. Now, I do think where we have a distinct number with it, it does all throughout the rest of Scripture. It means a 24-hour period, so I'm not sure why it wouldn't in Genesis 1. So I think the Hebrew construct of that is there, but that's not the one that I get tripped up on. What I have in my Bible is a big circle around Exodus 20:11. So Rachel, if you have that, go ahead and read that in context.
Exodus 20:11. I want to make sure I get that right. Let's see. Okay. So it says, "For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and made it holy."
Okay, so what happens to the rest of that chapter?
Then it goes through all the 10 commandments. So like honoring your mother and father, do not murder, all those things.
Okay, so do we want to allegorize all that? I mean, do we want to say, well, the 10 commandments, it's more mythical, it's more slippery because we can make it say what we want. Is it really that there don't have any other gods before you, like the very first commandment? By the way, isn't it interesting that the very first commandment is thou shalt have no other gods before you? And here's what I'm going to challenge our listeners to when we get to it. It doesn't mean golf or money. It actually does mean no other gods. So we got to flesh that out. It's really interesting that he uses the word gods there, not golf or money or boats or airplanes or whatever your quote unquote God is. Because so we need to spend some time on that. But notice what Exodus 20:11 says. For in what? 6 days. The Lord created everything, right? And he goes from that into a very literal understanding of the 10 commandments, and we would say that's very literal. So I've always come back in all of my science as an anchor that I struggle more with Exodus 20:11 in the context of it, it's not Genesis 1, because as we look through, okay, the literal translation, we talked about the gap theory, we talked about day age. So those are going to be kind of your earlier church of up through, the 19th century. Then all of a sudden we end up with some, I think, some very interesting interpretations of Genesis 1. Okay, so this is kind of where I jump in and have done quite a bit of study in this. One of them is what we're going to call the framework hypothesis. Okay, so the next kind of three that kind of arise on the shores of Genesis are going to be the analogical days. Now, I think the analogical days, the framework hypothesis, and then what the newest one is the temple/functional view of Genesis. So we have three kind of newer ones, but honestly, the analogical days is going to be from Bavinck. So Herman Bavinck was a fantastic theologian. I mean, honestly, his book I actually was in a study group of Bavinck's writings, and he is phenomenally high scholar, high scripture. He comes from the Reformed theology side of things, and I think there's something to this. What that analogical type of language says, that look, yes, it's true that day is day, but that word day in the way God meant it might not be the exact same way as we mean day to day. So this gets into more of a, what did we really mean? Remember, we talked about the law of identity.
Yeah, what do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that, right? When you say day, are you saying day? So when God says day, what do we mean by day? And so it gets more into the language of what is behind the use of the word day. Again, in this analogical model, or this analogical day idea of that is an important one. And I think you can make the argument that there's some movement there. One of the ones that I'm going to talk about here in a second is the hypothesis. The framework hypothesis, I think, is onto something. This was proposed by Meredith Kline, and what it does is it brings together the first three and then the second three into this idea of 1 and 4 have some similarity to them, 2 and 5 has some similarities, and 3 and 6. Therefore, maybe it was 1 then 4, 2 then 5, 3 then 6, and it becomes what's called the framework hypothesis. Now, I don't agree with that, but I'm gonna say that I think she was onto something when she proposed that. Okay. Now, the newest kind of one that actually is only less than a decade or around there old is actually presented by John Walton. John Walton, I would encourage people to as an author, I think he's done some really good job with the hermeneutics and the background of the book of Genesis. But he's the one that comes up with the temple/functional view, which we've already talked about with the functional ontology versus material ontology. And he's going to lean much more towards, wait a minute, the whole narrative is dealing with the function of creation, not the form of creation. If you want that, I think there's some really good points to that. I would encourage people to wrestle with that and bring it up. Now, what I'm not going to go into, and what I am recovering from the university myself, is what's called a theistic evolutionist. Okay, I'm a recovering theistic evolutionist. And the reason why I don't like this view of Genesis is because I believe theistic evolution is a compromise between two worldviews that were never meant to come together. Because if you really understand evolution, and I'm not talking about change over time or descent with modification. When we use the word evolution in science, we are meaning nothing to everything. That is the story of evolution. So when we use that word, we should use it for the way real scientists use it. And that is, in the beginning there was nothing. The singularity leaped out of the nothingness. It hyper expanded into cooling. And therefore we have atoms and planets and us. That is the story of evolution, right? So where in that story do we put God or theism? Did he get the ball rolling? Did he just say, let the dot be, the singularity be, and everything else just kind of did itself with its own laws? Now, I have so many problems with the narrative, not because of really any of the theological implications, but because of the scientific explanations are not there. And we'll look at that down the road when we get into actual chemical evolution, cosmic evolution, and biological evolution. That's coming. We'll have some podcasts on that. But I don't think the theistic evolutionary camp, which is of course going to be proposed by Francis Collins, he was kind of one of the big proponents of this. I don't think that holds I don't think that tension between the two, I think those two worldviews are juxtaposed, the theistic worldview and the atheistic worldview through nothing, nothing is there and therefore it exploded and here we are. I don't think those two come together. So where do we go with this? And again, I want to be really careful to our listeners. I'm not a fan of like some type of weird Hegelian dialect that brings in, thesis propose some kind of middle ground because I've got all truth and here follow me. I don't like that language. It's very arrogant to me. What I think is going on here with the whole creation story, because like I said, I do not think you have science as we know science going on in those 6 days. Okay. I don't think science that you and I would understand today, whether we're wrestling with anything with thermodynamics or chemistry or physics or whatever, I don't think what we call science today happened as we know it today until the end of day 6. Okay, that's a very important point to me, because as our listeners might have remembered from some of our previous podcasts, when we have this concordism, which talks about trying to impose a modern cosmology on an ancient cosmology, I think that's going to lead to confusion and frustration. And so I want to be careful to say that I think that our current model of science as we know it, and as we use the great Descartes scientific method, we're going to be frustrated by bringing in our science, quote unquote, into those 6 days. So here's what I think is going on. If we take all of this in context, how do we resolve this problem of all these different views, right? I've proposed, I've really spoken on 8 different views, or excuse me, 7 different main views that through the history of this word created.
Can we also like go over those 8? Because I feel like my brain can be easily like, okay, we just talked about 100%. So many different things, and I'm like slightly lost. Like I am here, but I'm also not. So like,
yeah, I got you.
Like,
yeah, I know. Rachel, I love your honesty. Okay,
so like, here's the first 4 we talked about.
Okay.
Like before we move on too far.
Yeah, no,
quick
that's great.
Summary.
So number one's going to be the literal 6 24-hour days. Okay. Again, this is going to be, I think, the historical church is going to modern day authors might be like someone like Henry Morris would be a proponent of this. Or I would say that the church in general, historically, this is the dominant view. All right. So I don't think this is like some new view. I think we've changed the view because of quote unquote modern science, but that is the historical view of the church. All right.
And when you talk about the historical view, when did that like start changing? Just so we have a little bit of context for that.
Okay. Yeah. Bella, that's a great question. I think this gets like a little bit in probably the philosophy that maybe people will like hit like fast forward and skip through this. But we have to remember that there is a thread of humanism that runs all the way from Genesis 3 with when the Satan said, "Did God say?" That's the original temptation, but that's also the original seed of humanism. Okay. And the seed of humanism, that the superiority of the human thought, that we ourselves autonomously from any kind of outside revelation, we can really put the particulars together to describe and explain the absolutes. We don't need help. We don't need God. That lie, that seed began in Genesis 3, and it weaves itself up through the ancient Greeks, which are wonderful. Like, you look at Plato's talking about his forms. He's not talking about God. He's just talking about some kind of ordered structure, right? And then we come on up through the scholastics and maybe Thomism and Thomism with Thomas Aquinas. And I think that reason and revelation kind of hit their apex like this, right, with Thomas Aquinas, where revelation and reason are on par with one another. Again, we could talk about the philosophical. You could go back to the Magna Carta and maybe Occam and come up. But again, like I said, this bogs down in philosophy. But what's happening here is we're starting to trust our autonomous reasoning over divine revelation. Okay, this is really important. And you kind of hit, I would say you kind of hit, and this is debatable when it actually, but you see this kind of going, this cross current, and I think it kind of crosses over at about Aquinas. Okay, Aquinas brought some really beautiful things to the church, don't get me wrong, but you kind of get this reason and revelation being put on equal par. Once that starts to happen, now you're heading into the Renaissance, right? The rebirth. We're bringing back the classics, the Greek and Roman classics, and we're bringing back Latin and all these things, and our reason starts to be on the par. And what's happening to Revelation? Well, it's going down. right? And so this is where you start to question, well, really 24 hours? I mean, in the modern world, look at what we know about the universe, and
Like
we've got the
we know so much more now, and
we know
like
so much. Exactly, we know so much more now.
we know
We've
so much
got
more now than God did, you know.
exactly. See what's going on here, right? We've got the redshift and the Hubble telescope, and we've got all this great quantum, and we start to really think, look at how awesome we are. But remember my challenge. Remember how much time that we have as humans, right? Very, very little. If the universe is 16 billion years in the seconds, right? So we want to be careful with when we start to extrapolate our brilliance, because I think we're going to end in confusion. So what happens, per your question, Bella, is the church just looked at it? Because hey, here's one thing: hand someone the Bible and say, what do you think? Just read it. What do you think it says? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. On day one, he did. Oh, okay, well, day one. So what are you going to do? Well, it says day one. It says day two. It says day three. Exodus 20, it says 6 days. So if you hand that to someone, they're just going, yeah, he kind of meant 6 days. And guess what? That's what language was for. It didn't express to you what we did. But if you're enlightened through science, and if you understand empiricism and all this great thinking of the philosophers that are all dead now, you begin to bring in this arrogance that says, well, maybe what happened was.
Did God really say?
Did God? Well, see, okay, you're speaking my language there, Rachel, because that's what happens, right? We start to trust our quote unquote enlightened scientific minds. And I'm going to say, well, I think there's a lot more humility that we really, at the end of the day, are finite, and his transcendence is so much other than, you know what? I'm at the end of the day going to say, yeah, I'm pretty much comfortable with you explaining what you did. And I might not understand it fully, but I'm much more comfortable with that revelation knowledge than some autonomous reasoning of myself or humanity's knowledge.
And I like the point, sorry, Bella, I like the point where you're saying how like the 6 days, like anything before the 6 days might not have necessarily been the actual definition of like what we see as a day today, like our 24-hour period, because in those 6 days he was forming and like making everything. And so it's like we can't compute our normal 24-hour day until it was complete. So like to me that makes me feel better as someone who likes science and also faith as well, to be like, well, I think like God can mean the 6 days literally, but also not have it look the way we think it looks to our 24-hour time frame, because he was forming in that time frame. So I guess, I don't know, for me that felt helpful to be like, okay, like even though it wasn't necessarily maybe in the way that our minds can comprehend it, like it's still possible.
It's still possible. Well, and that's a nice segue into, or just a reminder, Rachel, because you asked the question, what were the quote unquote 7? And so, right, I'll just go through them real quick just to remind, because like I said, there's a lot of words to these, but you're going to have the literal, right, which is the literal 6 days, the Henry Morris type of person, the early church, I think, make that. Then you're going to bring in Schofield with really, once we start to talk about rationalism and all these things in the really the 19th century, then he's going, well, maybe there was really a big age and big gap, and this is where dinosaurs fit in and all that, the gap theory. And like I said, that's in a lot of commentaries or a lot of study Bibles, right? And then you're really going to move into the day age kind of language, and this is modern version. This is a 19th century construct, but really the days represent long ages, long epics, if you will. And this is going to be modern day Hugh Ross and Reasons to Believe, his type of ministry, which is fine. Like I said, he actually does have some really good things that I love. I just don't think the time one is necessarily one of those that I'm like, okay, I'm going to jump on.
And that was the 4th one?
That was the 3rd one, yes.
Okay.
So literal gap, day age. Your 4th one, kind of in chronology, is going to be the framework hypothesis. Again, this is going to be Meredith Klein, and this is going to be 1 and 3 are really related, 2 and 4. And I'm going to talk about, like I said, I am going to
get there,
because I do think she's onto something there that I personally like. Okay, so that's going to be your 4th one. Then your analogical day. This is going to be your high thinkers, your Reformed theologians. Like I said, like Bob Inc. Bob Inc. he's one of my heroes in the faith. So I love kind of reading his background stories and what's going on there. But I think there's some stuff with that I don't think we need. I think our misunderstanding of science, and we take our science and we try to make our theology align with our science. I don't think that's a good thing, because like I said, there's a lot of different sciences. So which science are you gonna try to make the Bible agree with the science of the 1700s? Are you going to try to make the Bible agree with the science of the 1800s? Are you going to try to
Which
make the
is
science
constantly changing, yeah.
Yeah, right. By its very nature, science constantly changes. So I want to be careful
Right.
that I don't try to make a historical document align with something that's a moving target, right? Because that's going to lead to some bad frustrations, I think. All right. So those are your five there. Then, of course, you're going to have the theistic evolution, which is the one I struggle with, and what I was taught at my university, which was a Christian university. So that was the one that, like I said, I'm recovering, undoing some of the stuff that I was taught because I just don't think it's actually very valid or true. And the seventh of those, the kind of the newest one, is this temple slash. It's called functional story, and this again comes from John Walton, and it's more of the function over the form. And again, like I said, I actually, there's some stuff that I really enjoy, and that's why we spent some time last podcast talking about that. So that's going to be your main seven. Now, here's what I'm going to propose as, and this is my, as like I said, it's not like I've got my own theory, but when I look at them all in their totality, I think, other than theistic evolution, I think, and I don't like gap or day age, so I think I'm just going to kind of set those aside. I don't like gap at all. I think that was anyway. But I think bringing together, how do we bring together the framework, the literal, maybe the temple slash functional and analogical? How do we bring some of these others that I think have some good, they have some good arguments, and I like them, so how would you synthesize maybe one idea of that creation week to bring those better ideas to me together? And what I propose personally, this is my own language that you can't really Google it because it's me, but I like what I call the chronological framework model. Okay, the CFM, chronological framework model.
CFM,
That's
I like
CFM,
that.
right?
We're
That's
gonna have to
Einstein's.
write a book on that one,
Right,
so
right,
you can
right.
have your
Well,
own theory.
and you guys know that I am in the process of writing a book, and so I will flesh this out in that book, in a chapter in that book. But here's what I think is going on. What I see, again, bringing all these together, if we bring Walton's form and function together, if we bring Klein's real framework understanding into this, if we bring Bavinck's analogical, if we bring all those together, like I said, this isn't novel to me. I'm just trying to synthesize what I think is a good way to approach this. What I think I see happening with this is not Klein's, the 1 and 4 are related, and then 2 and 5, and then 3 and 6. What I think we have going on instead of this is actually this, with, again, 2 triads. But the first triad is a triad because when you look at the Hebrew, you see a form, form, form. You see a form separate, form separate. And that's really important because the second triad, I think, is chronological. I don't think they're related like this, again, like the classic framework, but I think they're stacked on top of one another, because what I see going on in the first triad of creation is this forming and separating, forming and separating, forming, right? Create light separated from the darkness, create water separated from the above from the below, create land and separate it from the vegetation, right? There's a creating and a separating, or a forming and separating. Okay, now here's what's important about this. This is not science. I'm not going to try to bring in my understanding of my beloved carbon within this, because what I see happening with a good creation narrative is when I see him forming, you have to remember, if humanity is the apex of creation, if it's the pinnacle of creation, in order for us to be who we are in our carbon suits, in order for carbon to do what it does to make the beautiful organic molecules and biomolecules that make up life possible, you have to bring into existence matter, energy, light, space, time. All these have to be brought in. So think of the analogy of, if we're going to start with nothing and we're going to make a grandfather clock, right? We have this, let us make a grandfather clock. Okay. The first thing I have to do to make the grandfather clock is I have to speak into existence glass for the lid, wood for the frame, metal, paint. I have to speak all that into, I have to form all of that. And I might have to separate the glass from the wood or the metal from the paint, right? But I have to bring all of that into actual being. And once it's all ready to go, once I have the paint and the metal and the glass and the wood, now what I can do is I can take all what I just formed and separated, Now I can move into the second triad, which is going to be filling and decorating. And that's why I think what's happening here in the creation story is you have form, separate, form, separate, form, separate. Then you have fill, decorate, fill, decorate, fill, decorate. Because think of what's filled and decorated on day 4, the sun, the moon, the stars, right? They're to govern the time and the light and the day and the night and all these beautiful things, right? And then on the day 5, what does he form and decorate it with? Or excuse me, fill and decorate it with? The birds and the fish and the skies and the sea, right? And then the final one, what does he fill and decorate it with? Animals and humankind, right? Adam. And I think what's going on there is this absolute beautiful story of all of these beautiful function. Here's how I formed it. Here's why I formed it, right? Because it's going to function as a vessel that receives my Shekinah, that I can dwell with and I can have relationship with. You are the pinnacle because I am going to walk with you because you're a triune being, because you're made in my image, right? And so to me, the Genesis story is so beautiful, and this chronological framework model, is the CFM, is a way to say that I'm not going to throw out, I'm not going to throw out the framework or the analogical or the function temple idea of Walton, Bobbink, and Klein. I'm going to say, is there a way to bring those high thinkers into more of a total picture that might be frustrating as science, but I think it's the narrative of what's going on here. And so that to me is a way forward to as, and I think Bella made the comment earlier before even we started recording that this is really a back burner topic, but I think in our world of a STEM focus world, we do have questions in this, and I think people are like, well, I'm not really comfortable with the crunchy 24-hour day thing. Not that, again, at the end of the day, it makes a lot of sense. But what I think, what I think when we can bring together is literally a higher view of scholarship, understanding the limit and the scope of science and what it is and what it isn't, and to say that I truly believe that revelation through the written word of God, right? And as you guys know, I believe it from end to amen. I believe that we don't have to separate that and set it aside with our logic and our reason. I believe that they complement, but at the end of the day, through the humility to say, you know what? We might not know what happened ultimately. We're seeing little bits and pieces of it as we play with it, through the scientific method, and we can harness it and put someone around the moon like we just did, or, make a watch, or, we could do stuff with it. But ultimately, when we start to ask the big metaphysical questions, we're really limited by our finite humanity in those. And that's why I think that the beautiful narrative of Genesis gives us a rich understanding of the whole creation. So when God says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth.
Well, that's really interesting to listen to how those different theories can kind of come together and make the CMF, as you say.
It makes me think of EMFs, and I'm like, that's not the same thing. But
and so when I initially heard it, my thought was so how does that relate to the 24-hour day? But as I think about it, and correct me if I'm wrong, kind of more what you're saying through this perspective is we might never know what the 24-hour day meant, how many, there's so much debate about that. And really there's no way for us to know because, as you said, the science now is not necessarily the science then. But through the form and the function and the decorating, we can see that the creation narrative and the creation story really shows that God created this grandfather clock, as you said earlier, in a very ordered, beautiful process that does demonstrate a lot of scientific theory through it, even if we might not have the specifics of the theory. Does that kind of make sense? Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and Bella, let me just follow up with that because you're spot on, because I think the grandfather clock model, right? We form. Now we filled. We decorated. So we brought the wood together, and but remember the function part of it. It's not a grandfather clock until when? Well, until it's all brought into existence and then built and then painted and decorated and then what? Wound up, and and set on the set on the mantle or wherever, and it's
Right.
functioning for its intended use and purpose, which you guys know is the word righteousness, right?
Right.
So it's not functioning until when? Until the end of day 6. And this is why the language, when God says, he looks back and he says in Genesis 1:31, it is very good, right? And to me, that's when he looks back and the grandfather clock is functioning, it's ticking and talking to its intended use and for purpose and function. And that's the whole creation. He looks
Right.
back and says, it is very good, right? Not just good, but it's very good.
Mm-hmm.
Now here's what I will say. Okay, this is what gets really cool with the whole time thing. And I alluded to this in a previous podcast. I think what's happening, if we keep science out of the 6 days of creation, okay, keep science out of there. When the reason why I started this whole podcast today with this whole time translation invariance, it makes the assumption that the laws, quantum, whatever you want, whatever law you want to put, that the laws are assumed to be constant or held consistent everywhere in the universe and at all times. This is the key. Because what I don't think is happening is those 6 days when time and space are being brought into existence, unless I have an external perspective on how much time has passed, I have no clue. And this is why when we get in, and those the high thinkers that are like, hey, I want to delve into this. And in fact, Isaac is one of those, Bella, that has read the Science of God by Schroeder. Pick up his Science of God, read chapter 5. Your mind will be blown that he actually correlates a really an idea of the 6 days of Genesis are perfectly aligned with the 16 billion years of the assumption of the time translation invariance. If it's true, you get 16 billion. If you're outside of that and it's not true, you get 6,000. And he's one of the very first high thinkers that helped me see that we're really talking about two different clocks here. You have
Sorry,
right?
I just am like connecting what you just said because I didn't really understand what you were saying when you were saying 16 is a billion. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
So that's saying that in the time variance theory, if you look at it one way, the Earth is 16 billion years or whatever, and then if you look at it from a different time perspective, it's 6,000. So like the young Earth versus the old Earth kind of comparison. Oh gosh, that makes so much more sense now.
And so what happens with this is you have to remember that time, tick tock, chronos time, not kairos time. Kairos time is moments. Remember the two different times, chronos and kairos. But chronos time, tick tock, is the fourth dimension of the universe, and it's bound by the expansion, right? So if the universe is expanding, it can be expanding faster than the speed of light, because light, the assumption that the speed of light is constant is only within a local time frame within the bounds of a vacuum. And anyway, it gets into a little bit of the special theory of relativity. But what's happening there is as the universe is hyper expanding, I believe faster than the speed of light, which is not a problem, it doesn't violate that, which is the point. You actually have what's called time dilation going on, and so you can make a curve, exponential curve, and it actually would look this way. Okay, that curve is the same as the 16 billion, and so you actually get absolute time. So a time perspective outside of the hyper expansion is going to say 6,000. A bound person within the expansion is going to look out and say, oh, it's 16 billion. So you have absolute time, God's time, or you have relative time, man's time. But here's the problem. You still don't have enough time with, even if it were 16 tick-tock chronos billion, without it being, which I don't think it is, by the way. But if it were, you still don't have enough time for nothing to everything evolution to be rational. And so even with that, 16 billion is a drop in a bucket of the probability that what we would need to be able to get novelty in what we see in all the species across the earth. And that's why that whole theistic evolution side of the conversation to me is not science, not theology. It's bad philosophy. I don't think that's the way forward.
And it's kind of just like there's no amount of time that could pass that would make it make sense for something to come from nothing.
Correct. It's not improbable. It's impossible. There's a difference there, right? And when you start to talk about probabilities, the numbers of the probability of homochirality and all this incredible fine tuning is so astronomically big that it's not improbable, it's impossible. Even with an infinite number of universes, which is an absurdity because it's non-falsifiable garbage, you don't have enough logic and reason for that to even be. I mean, again, you might have enough faith to believe it, but there's not enough evidence to support it. But yeah, you can believe whatever you want. That's why I've always joked with, yeah, you can also believe that there's a great big pink unicorn on Mars and it said let there be. You know, you have about as much evidence in that theory as you do nothing to everything.
Yeah.
Think this is crazy. I feel like that was just like a drop the mic moment. Like I just feel like it all just connected in my brain, and like it brought all of the topics that we've been talking about over like the past couple episodes, and I feel like it just kind of like made it cohesive for some reason. Like it
Wow.
just like clicked in my brain.
Wow. Wow. I
But
love that. I love that.
so I feel like there was something that I was gonna mention about the creation story again, but I kind of lost my train of thought.
I'm sorry.
I think I was so mind blown that I was like, lost my thought.
Well, I think that's a good place to end if you're that mind blown, Rachel.
I know, that's what I'm saying. I'm like, I don't think we need to talk anymore.
Well, let me ask you guys then. Listening to me yap for 40 minutes. What is your takeaway from this? What is encouraging to you two that you're like, okay, because we've talked about a lot, right? This is one of those, again, kind of like drinking from the fire hose. But what are some of the big, like, oh, okay, that actually helps resolve maybe my understanding of the beauty and the relationship of Scripture or anything like that?
I feel like for me, honestly, and I think we had mentioned this when Rachel and I, like months ago, did our initial, like, we're going to dive into science kind of episode. We just started up the series. I kind of had mentioned to Rachel, like, I honestly don't necessarily struggle with the whole problem of old earth, young earth. Like, in my head, it's not really a big part of like where my faith in the Bible comes from. And so it's like really not that problematic for me. I'm just like, it doesn't feel that integral one way or another. But the one thing I like talking about this topic is, as we look deeper at how, like, the details of the creation story and how God created what we see and what we live in, it shows, I think it reveals a lot about his character. And like, there's so much order to it, but there's also so much like artistry and beauty, and like you can see just a lot of like his love for his creation through it. And so just to be able to dive deeper into what creation is and what it means for us, I think it does a really good job at revealing like the character of God through that.
Wow.
I don't know if that makes sense.
Oh, totally.
Yeah,
Totally.
that's good. Also, I'm really bad at knowing like who always writes all the books of the Bible, but did Moses technically write Genesis?
Yeah.
So
Well,
something
again,
that just
yeah.
Sorry, you can keep going.
No, well, and you know, there is thin scholarship that would say that, well, no, it was it was a combination, but you know, Jesus was convinced that Moses wrote it, so I'm going with Jesus.
Yeah, exactly. I trust that one.
Yeah, me too.
But anyway, something that just kind of like, I guess made me think more about the creation story and how we can either, you know, choose to believe like what the Lord has said about it or try to put in our modern day thought into it. Like you were saying, time in like the first, I mean, you said technically time within the first 6 days, like might not look like the time that we see now.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, but once those 6 days were done, then it made sense. And so I think if the Lord intended to write a book to us for us to understand something, he would want to write it in a context that we could understand. And so like, for example, like let's say in those 6 days, it wasn't a 24-hour period, but our brains weren't going to understand that type of time or form, then like I believe that he would like inspire Moses to write it in a certain way that people can understand.
Yeah.
And so I don't know, I just like whether it was the 24-hour period like we have it now or not, like I feel like the Lord wrote it in a perfect way, like to help us understand it.
Well,
and
oh yeah.
Sorry, I feel like I'm trying to like get my thought to come across correctly, and I don't know if it's coming across correctly.
Yeah.
Because like, for example, like let's say like in the first 3 triads, it was form, form, form. So he like, let's say made time in those 3 days
Yeah,
or whatever. And it was like,
correct.
let's say it was like a legit 24 hours.
Yeah,
And then in the next 3, he like filled and decorated and all those things.
yeah,
Like when now, like, it's like, he obviously did all those things and then later gave it to Moses to write about.
yeah,
So like it's like from a past or like it's like from a future tense looking backwards.
yeah,
So like
yeah,
he's telling Moses like, okay, like this is how it happened, and like it was a legit like 24-hour days or whatever.
yeah,
But like that's how Moses sees it. So I
yeah.
don't know. I feel like he's trying to give it in a way that we can understand it.
Well, remember who the Bible was written to, right? When Moses was writing it, I do believe Moses wrote the first 5 books. Um, he wrote it to slaves, right? They were Egyptian slaves, or excuse me, Israeli or Jewish slaves. That was his intended audience, right? It wasn't theologians or high scientists. It was just like here. I want you to know what happened, and I'm going to write it down. And I believe it's accurate, right? I believe it's accurate, reliable, and true on the narrative that was handed down. And that's why I think we can go back and we don't have to reinterpret it through scientific or high philosophy lenses. We don't need to, because to me, so much of that has that, again, like I said, this invariance bias or this humanistic bias. We want to be careful that we don't try to read into it this modern cosmology when it was ancient cosmology. And the ancient cosmology was a very simplistic way of saying, hey, there was God and he said let there be, and it was, right? And I think at the end of the day, though we can do a higher scholarship, and I think that you were kind of getting into the analogical language there, that analogical model of when time language is analogous rather than identical to human time, right? What do you mean by that? And that's why I think I don't necessarily disagree with Bobbing's take on this analogical model. I just think that we can build on it and add to it the framework and the functional, and come up with a tiny bit better a way of thinking that let's bring these 3 together and kind of go forward with what I think is a pretty strong model, but yet still retains their chronology. It still totally allows for the 24-hour days, but yet it also says that, hey, within the hyper expansion of the 6 days, it was weird. Things were going on. We don't know what it was. We need an external opinion as to what was going on. I just take it that's in his clock, absolute time. He did it in 6,000 years. In relativistic invariance time, sure. If you want to say 16 billion, that's your prerogative. But I think the model then says that it's still God did this his way and gave us that knowledge, and we can rest on it. And like Bella said, I'm cool with that.
Yeah, and like I feel like, again, like if the intention of the book was to be written to slaves and like also people at that time, like it's not like they were these highly educated people who went to
Correct.
college and like
Correct.
had all this knowledge. Like they just like trusted in the truthfulness of someone or something, and they like
Yes.
just believed in Jesus, and there wasn't this like, oh well, I'm smarter than you, and it was kind of a pride thing almost. Like
Yeah.
I feel like they didn't
With you.
have that pride to be like, oh, well, I'm greater than you and I can think higher than you. And I also, like, on another note, just like that, even though there's like 7 different theories you could say to like view Genesis, that we can pick and choose a little bit of different people's thought processes, because again, like we're all not God, like we don't
Yeah.
know everything,
Yeah.
but like we can use our minds to work and process it together. Because like I know when I try to think about something myself, I usually don't think about it in a good like or in a complete way, where then when I say, oh hey Bella, what do you think about this, or hey Dr. Anstein, I'm questioning this, what do you think about it, like when we process things together, it helps us to like understand a problem or a situation so much better and make it more like, oh, that makes sense. And so I feel like it's
Yeah.
a similar thing where it's like we have all
Yeah.
these high thinkers who are very smart and wise and have all this knowledge,
Sure.
like you.
Sure. Yeah.
And but now
Oh.
we can like
No.
talk about it and like
Yeah.
process it together, and then that can help us like view something in a more beautiful way. And so like even with Genesis now, like I feel like it is more I guess I now viewing the Genesis story feel more at peace knowing that we've talked about all this too, because I've struggled with the science side of it where I was like, it's black or white, like you either know this
Yeah.
or you don't, you know? But
Yeah.
it's like, okay, but that's again taking the mystery and the beauty away from God and what he can do outside of our human realm of knowledge and our 5 senses. So
Yeah.
anyway, hopefully that all made sense.
Love it. No, it does. It does.
But I think those are my final thoughts. Any other thoughts?
I think that's a good place to wrap it up.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I
Well,
feel like we
thank you
covered
guys
a
for
lot.
listening. Yeah, this episode was good, and I feel like it kind of helped land the plane a little bit on our creation topic and just all the days of creation in Genesis 1, and maybe we'll get into the fall and some bigger and better things next time.
Can't wait. Can't wait.
Awesome. All right, well, thank you guys for listening, and tune in to our next episode.